Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into the totally fascinating and, honestly, pretty chaotic legal evolution of Bollywood. We're going to look at how an industry that used to run completely on informal trust and family ties morphed into this massive, globalized powerhouse driven by airtight corporate contracts. Let's get right into it. So, here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll start with the handshake era, then look at the epic Sholay copyright dispute. After that, we dive into the battle for royalties, how creators are protecting the pitch, and finally, the big corporate shift.
All right, Section 1, the handshake era, running on trust.
For decades, Bollywood was this incredibly inward-looking network. It was almost completely devoid of what we'd call typical corporate practices. Like legal experts Nishith Desai Associates pointed out, most agreements back then were just verbal, and the few that actually made it onto paper, well, they were rarely enforceable. I mean, just think about how wild that is for a second. We're talking about massive, multi-million-dollar movies funded by private financiers who, by the way, often charged sky-high interest rates, and the whole shebang was sealed with a simple verbal agreement. The entire system was literally built on personal relationships and handshakes. But what happens when those handshakes break? Because let's be real, when millions of dollars and legacy IP are on the line, memories start to fade, relationships sour, and suddenly, verbal trust just doesn't cut it anymore. As we're about to see, the real-world fallout from this lack of paperwork was absolutely severe.
Which brings us to Section 2, the Sholay copyright dispute, decades of ambiguity.
This first case study really shows just how chaotic things could get. Back in 1973, the legendary scriptwriting duo Salim Javed pitched what would become the absolute iconic film Sholay to Sippy Films. The movie drops in 1975, becomes a massive hit, and is shown across different media for nearly 4 decades. But get this, it wasn't until 2012, almost 40 years later, that a massive lawsuit was actually filed over who held the copyright to make a 3D version. Think about that. 40 years of big business, all tracing back to one initial verbal pitch.
So the plaintiffs claimed they had verbally entrusted in confidence the rights to the production firm. But when it got to the Bombay High Court, they pointed out a pretty astonishing fact. There was zero documentation. Literally nothing. Not even a basic distribution agreement. And without paper, courts are basically forced to guess the terms of a decades-old oral deal, leaving incredibly valuable intellectual property just hanging in total limbo. It was a massive wake-up call to the industry that verbal deals are an absolute legal nightmare.
Moving on to Section 3, the battle for royalties, IPRS versus Yash Raj Films. Just take a look at that number. 100 crores rupees. In 2019, an FIR was filed against the heavyweight production house Yash Raj Films by the Indian Performing Rights Society, or IPRS, alleging the misappropriation of this staggering amount in royalties. The accusation here was that YRF used its massive bargaining power to force artists into contracts that stripped them of the royalties they rightfully earned.
To really understand this, we need to look at how the law actually defines ownership. Under the Copyright Act, an author is the actual creator, so your composer or lyricist. The owner, on the other hand, is typically the production house that finances them. Now, for years, production houses essentially acted as if being the owner meant they owned absolutely every single right to the music, end of story. But the 2012 Copyright Amendment Act completely changed the game and drew a hard line between the two. The law made it clear, even if a production house holds the assigned copyright, they do not possess the author's distinct right to receive royalties. That right stays with the creators. So those days of producers just quietly burying a royalty waiver in a massive contract, yeah, legally, those days were over. So IPRS challenged the production house using criminal breach of trust under the Indian Penal Code. They argued that 3 specific legal pillars were met here. First, an entrustment of property occurred. Second, that property was misappropriated for the production house's own use. And third, it was done with dishonest intention for wrongful gain. Now, while the Bombay High Court did initially stay the investigations, this whole legal framework shows exactly how artists are now weaponizing strict legal definitions to fight back against those informal power imbalances of the past.
Okay, let's look at Section 4, protecting the pitch, Sundial versus Zee Telefilms.
So what happens before a script is even written? Back in 2001, a company called Sundial Communications pitched a highly detailed TV concept called Kanaya to Zee Telefilms. We're talking full treatments, character breakdowns, production methods, the works. But shortly after, they claimed their concept was just taken and used without their consent.
The tricky part here is the classic idea versus expression dichotomy in entertainment law. You generally can't copyright a raw, abstract idea. So the big question became, how on earth do creators protect their pitches? Well, the Bombay High Court stepped in with a pretty landmark ruling. They stated that if you have a sufficiently developed concept and you share it under circumstances implying confidentiality, it actually can qualify for protection. They applied the doctrine of breach of confidence, basically recognizing that if the law doesn't protect concept pitches, it would completely stifle the creative lifeblood of the whole industry. The practical, everyday solution that came out of this era was the widespread adoption of non-disclosure agreements, or NDAs. To take that vague expectation of trust and turn it into a concrete legal duty, an effective NDA really needs three things. You have to clearly identify the parties involved. You need a highly precise definition of what the confidential information actually is, and you must establish specific obligations and remedies if a breach happens. Basically, no more implied trust. You have to put it in writing. This judgment absolutely forced the industry to grow up fast. The Wild West days of just grabbing ideas shifted into formal licensing agreements. Production houses started making creators sign NDAs before they'd even listen to a pitch, and creators began meticulously registering their treatments with copyright societies. Real, structured protections had finally arrived on the scene.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, the corporate shift, a global Bollywood.
The government actually played a massive role in this transition. In 2001, the Indian government officially granted industry status to Bollywood. This was a total game changer because it finally opened the doors for formal bank financing. Fast forward to today, and 100% foreign direct investment is permitted. Naturally, this huge influx of institutional money from banks, VCs, and foreign studios demanded strict accountability. And that demand for accountability was the final nail in the coffin for handshake deals, replacing them for good with legally binding written contracts.
And you can see how corporatization brought massive financial scale. Between 2018 and 2021, top Bollywood production houses, we're talking giants like Yash Raj Films, Dharma Productions, and Fox Star Studios, were generating hundreds of crores in average revenue. Institutional funding enabled much greater efficiency and the ability to absorb massive risks, but it also led to a real consolidation of power into these legally fortified mega studios.
Because of this massive scale, modern contracts are incredibly precise. Take a look at the concept of theatrical holdbacks. Distribution contracts today carve out highly specific exclusive time windows, usually 4 to 12 weeks for digital platforms and maybe 4 to 6 weeks for TV in India, where a movie can only be shown in theaters. It's designed to protect that crucial theatrical revenue from immediate OTT and television competition. It's a highly negotiated, absolutely standard legal clause that just proves how sophisticated risk mitigation has become in the industry. So, today's landscape, it looks absolutely nothing like the past. Large studios now have their own in-house distribution verticals, which cuts out those old informal middlemen. Exhibitors, like the big multiplex chains, use standard, non-negotiable revenue-sharing agreements, and post-pandemic, deep-pocketed streamers like Netflix and Prime Video have really turned the industry into a concentrated buyer's market. To minimize financial risk, even the biggest A-list actors are now frequently required to take profit shares instead of demanding steep upfront fees. So, what's the big takeaway from this explainer? Is that the transition is complete. The Indian film industry has totally transformed from this familial, inward-looking network running on verbal trust into a highly complex, globalized ecosystem. It fundamentally relies on intellectual property rights, non-disclosure agreements, and international corporate standards now. And sure, while these legal structures can sometimes create imbalances in bargaining power, they ultimately save the industry from the sheer chaos of undocumented deals. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with this thought. We've moved from the chaos of handshakes to the strict rigidity of corporate contracts. But with a few deep-pocketed streamers now dominating as a buyer's market and basically dictating the terms, has corporatization finally brought true order to Bollywood? Or has it just set the stage for an entirely new set of legal battles over market control? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning, and I'll see you next time.